privileged to have her as a guest, and we extend you a sincere welcome. Welcome, ma'am.
Shall I start?
No, no, just a minute.
Okay.
Also, a warm welcome is extended to Professor Micah Wilson, who will be delivering a public talk tomorrow in the same stage. And also, Ms. Roma Agrawal's mother is here. I extend a warm welcome to her also. Welcome, ma'am. And next to our esteemed audience, I extend a sincere welcome to each of you, be it students, educators, professionals, or science enthusiasts. Your presence encourages to conduct more sessions like this. And once again, I welcome everyone to this amazing lecture. Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce the speaker for the day, Ms. Roma Agrawal. She is an Indian British American chartered structural engineer based in London. She has worked on several major engineering projects, including the Shard, the tallest building in Western Europe. Beyond her impressive engineering feast, Agrawal is an accomplished author and a vocal advocate for diversity in engineering. In 2018, she was appointed a member of the Order of British Empire and has received numerous awards, including the Institution of Structural Engineers Young Structural Engineer of the Year Award in 2011 and the Royal Academy of Engineering Roorkee Award for Public Promotion of Engineering in 2017. She is also a passionate public speaker, sharing her experiences and insight into the world of engineering. Agrawal's commitment to raising awareness of engaging engineering led her to be a founding member of the Your Life campaign, aiming to change perceptions of science and engineering among school children. Today, Ms. Agrawal will be sharing insights on the intriguing topic, nuts and bolts, how a nail built the world, or why we should reinvent the wheel. Over to you, ma'am. I welcome you to deliver the speech.
Thank you. Are my slides connected? My slides. Oh, perfect. And this one, I can use this to move. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. So I did a talk this morning for a college in Thiruvananthapuram, and I'm going to tell you the same thing, that my number one rule is that nobody's allowed to call me ma'am, okay? Everybody's going to call me Roma if you have any questions or anything. So thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. This is the first time I've been in Kerala. I've lived in many places around the world, including 10 years that I spent in Mumbai, but I'd never been to Kerala. So this is such a joy for me to be here and to be with all of you. So, as you mentioned in the introduction, I practiced as a structural engineer for a number of years. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about that work, and then I would love to tell you some stories about engineering after that, okay? So just to start off with my background, these are photos of me from a very long time ago. I'm not going to tell you how long. How many of you wore your dad's suits? Anybody? Nobody. Come on, so there must be some other nerd like me in the audience. No? Okay, that's really sad. I must have been 4 or 5 years old in these photographs, and my dad was an electrical engineer. And he used to work in the US. I was in the US till I was 6, and I used to wear his suits and tie, as you can see. And then you can see I'm playing with some blocks there. I've made some kind of flying device, which I don't think would actually fly. Anybody else play with Lego, make stuff, break stuff, at least have some? Yes, okay, thank you. But no, are you sure nobody wore suits, their dad's suits? You sure? No, okay, fine. So my job is in structural engineering. How many of you are familiar with structural engineering? Yeah? Quite a few. So the way I explain it, because there's a lot of people from outside the world of engineering who don't know what that is, and you can steal this content from me if you want, okay? If there's any structural, how many of you are structural engineers in the audience? Quite a few. Okay, so you're allowed to steal this line, okay? So if somebody asks you, but what do you do? Are you an architect? That's the biggest question I get asked. I'm like, no, I'm not an architect. As a structural engineer, what I do is I make buildings and bridges stand up. Simple, nice, everybody can understand that, okay? So I wanted to share with you some of the projects that I worked on during my career. So the middle one is a footbridge in Newcastle, which is in northern England, and it connects two sides of a campus together. So the new campus had been built, and in the middle there was a big highway and a rail line. And so they were thinking about how do we join these up? Because the dean and the VC of the university said, oh, our poor students, they're partying all night, then they wake up, and to get from one campus to the other, they have to walk 1 full kilometer, and they go over this rickety little footbridge, and then they come to the other side of the campus. So why don't we make a nice footbridge for them? So back in 2005, I started my work as a structural engineer. I actually had studied up to ICSC level in India, always liked maths and physics. I went to London after that to do my 11th and 12th, and I did maths, advanced maths, physics, and design and technology. And then I studied physics at university for 3 years as my undergrad. So this is a very interesting thing for me to learn from all of you, is that I was in a girls' school for my 11th and 12th, and I was studying all of these subjects, and still nobody suggested to me to consider engineering as a viable degree or career path to go on. And then when I went on my physics degree, 10% of the students were women. Now, the college I went to this morning had 50% of the students were women in the engineering faculty. So I was very happy to see that. And I want to learn why you think that that's the case here. What's the difference in the culture and the understanding of engineering? So after doing my undergraduate in physics, I did a 1-year master's in structural engineering, and then this was the first project that I worked on. So on my 22nd birthday, I started my new job, and that project was built in 2006, and I went to visit it last year. It's still standing, so that's a really good sign. You know, as a structural engineer, that's a tick. You're like, yeah, my structure's still standing 18 years later. On your left is a picture of the Shard, which is the building that was mentioned in my introduction. It's the tallest building in Western Europe, so the tallest in the UK. And I spent 6 years of my career on that. So I was lucky enough to do a footbridge and a skyscraper. And then to give you a bit of a contrast, I've also got a picture of an art installation. So an artist designed this structure which went into a very historical part of London temporarily, just for a few months. And we weren't allowed to put any kind of foundation or support into the historical paving. So they needed a structural engineer to design some kind of a base so that the people, they climbed up the sculpture and sat on the top to look at the views. That thing wouldn't fall over. So how many of you thought, even those of you who are structural engineers, that, oh, maybe someday I would get to work on an art installation? Right? It's kind of cool. Something a bit different. So these are some of the photographs. I just wanted to show you the kind of different trajectories and paths that my career took, right? Because I started off in my dad's suit somewhere in the US. I then went into engineering. So this photograph here is when I went on a construction site. That's the top of the Shard. And I was very scared of heights. So like the fence was here, and I was kind of standing here and just leaning over a little bit because I didn't find it very comfortable at all. And then I've become really passionate about trying to get more people into engineering, particularly in the UK. And I mentioned a bit of the gender disparity that we have, and so I love speaking to young women in particular. I've done lots of talks. This is when I went back to the university. So look, there's photographic evidence that my bridge is still there, okay, from last year. And then I was lucky enough to be on a very iconic British quiz called University Challenge. But I went on the alumni show where they really dumbed down the questions for people like me to appear. And they asked me a question about the Shera, so I got that answer, which I was very happy about. And my team was pretty happy as well. What I wanted to do today is, rather than talk to you about structural engineering or my particular career, and we can talk about those things more during the Q&A for sure, was to tell you about my latest book, which is called Nuts and Bolts. And I have some of the copies I have one copy each of my 3 books that you can have a look at afterwards. It's about 7 small inventions that change the world. One of the topics of discussion I love to have during the Q&A is whether you agree with my list or would you like to add something more or subtract something from my list, okay? So my list is the nail, wheel, spring, lens, magnet, string, and pump. Okay, that's my list of 7. So have a think about it and see whether there's other things that you think of. And the idea was that during the pandemic, when I was writing this book, I was thinking about all the very complex pieces of engineering that we have around us. So we have a speaker here, we have the laptop, the mic that I'm wearing, this television screen, the photographer's camera. But what are the elements, the small elements that make these more complicated technologies possible? What are the stories of those elements? So I'm going to talk to you about the nail and the wheel, which was missing off my slide, but wheel, and magnet today. Okay, so let's start with the nail. How many of you have ever looked at a nail and gone, wow, what an amazing piece of engineering this is? Anybody? No. Okay, so neither had I. Okay, and if you're anything like me, if I open up my desk drawer, there are lots of nails just, they're lying there. I've often put up pictures in my house and I'm whacking the nail and then it bends and I'm like, whatever, just throw it away. So I think we take it for granted, maybe. We take nails for granted. But when I decided to actually look at the history of the nail, it kind of blew my mind, okay? So why is the nail special in the history of humanity's innovation and technology? So if you think about it, you go back thousands of years, when we used to make things, supposing we wanted to make a sharp tool, we would take a stone and we would shape that tool, that stone, to create a sharp tool. If we wanted a spear, we used to cut off the top of a branch, make it sharp, and that used to be our spear. Maybe we would use a vine or something to attach the stone tool to the branch to create a spear, but then that vine would rot and, it's organic matter, so it wouldn't last very long. So we used to make things out of one object. Now, the nail was the first piece of technology that allowed us to join two things together in a robust way. Okay, so they wouldn't just fall apart. It's not organic, it's quite permanent. So can you imagine the complexity of the stuff that we could create once we had formed the nail? So if I think about the story of the nail, I can tell you that story in 3 different ways. And I'm like, which one should I pick? I don't know which one to pick because they're all so very interesting. So you could tell the story of materials, you could tell the story of the method you used to make the nail, or you could tell the story of the humans, the people who are behind the story of the nail as well. So if I start quickly with materials, you can't make a nail without metal, right? Because you need a substance, you can heat it up, you can change its shape, it needs to be ductile enough to form a sharp point, and then it needs to cool down and retain that shape, and then when you hammer that into another material like wood, it retains its shape, and then it has enough friction to keep the two things together. And before humans figured out how to use metals, that wasn't possible. So copper was one of the first materials that was used to create nails. And if I go down to the third line, in fact, it was the ancient Egyptians, 6,000 years ago, that we have found some of the oldest nails in the world. So we think that they were very pioneering users of the nail. And they used their nail to put together their ships, for example. So can you imagine that basically ships would not exist if you didn't have the nail, right? So it's kind of an important piece of engineering. Then you get to bronze. And I apologize to any chemists in the room if I get this the wrong way around, because I very often do. But in my head, bronze is the combination of tin and copper. Is that right? Not the other way around. Yeah, good. So then the politics of our world comes in. How does politics affect engineering and science? Okay, tin was available in one part of the world. Copper was available in a different part of the world. So to create bronze, you need to bring those two things together. And that was possible for a while. But then there was a very tumultuous period in the Middle East A lot of political uncertainty, wars, problems, and so people couldn't connect these two materials together, and so the use of bronze stopped. Okay, so sometimes the engineers might have the solution, like, oh, do this and this, but the reality of the world doesn't allow you to actually complete that task. Then we come to iron, and the Iron Age started here, in southern India and in Sri Lanka. And have you heard of Wootz iron? So that Wootz iron, that's how they spell it, W-O-O-T-Z, was the original formula of iron that was produced in this part of the world. This was the best iron produced, and the Iron Age started the earliest in this part of the country, much before it started in Europe. And from here, the iron was exported to ancient Roman civilization, 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So I'm coming back down to the third line again. I'm showing you the connection of the Indians and the Romans. So the Indians and the Romans used to trade in iron. But the Indians said, we're not going to tell the Romans what our formula is for this iron, because otherwise they'll go make it themselves. So they kept their trade secret, and this import-export relationship continued for quite a long time. And the Romans made thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions, probably, of nails in order to create all of their structures in the incredible civilization that they established in Europe. Then we figured out steel. And then probably a lot of you are much more familiar with steel. So it's a cousin of iron. It has exactly the right amount of carbon so that it's strong, it's not too soft, it's not too brittle. So steel is like the ultimate answer for the best material to create nails. And that happened during the Industrial Revolution in the UK, when one of the engineers called Henry Bessemer figured out how to manufacture steel on a big, huge scale. Okay, and that's when nails started becoming cheap. So my favorite story then, because I've got the Americans mentioned as well, my favorite story about the nail is when the British had colonized huge parts of the world. So if we go back to around the 1700s or 1600s, when they were ruling the US, because nails were so expensive, the material was so expensive, and the labor to make the nails was so expensive, they banned the export of nails from the island. But the US has so many houses built out of wood, because that's a very big natural source, natural material for them. So if a family was going to move from one part of the country to another, they were going to move their homes, their belongings, their life, they would burn down their original house, okay? And from the ashes, they would collect up the nails, the precious, precious nails, and they would take those with them to the next place and build up their new home. And it got so bad that the state of Virginia had to pass a law banning people from burning their houses down, and then they were promised to be given some money, some compensation for the value of the nails that they would have left behind. Okay, and you just think about that in contrast to me with my drawer of nails. I'm whacking them, throwing them in the bin, no problem. So how many of you think that nails are an incredible piece of engineering now? I must have convinced some of you. Yeah? Okay, I have a couple of nods. Listen, I'm very, very keen that I get lots and lots of questions and discussion at the end, okay? So please don't be shy about asking questions at the end. So just think about your questions and keep them ready for me. So just to finish off on the nail quickly, I looked at the evolution of the nail as well. So there are different types of nails shown here, different ways of manufacturing them, including a wooden dowel, which was used in a lot of ships. I explore rivets, because without rivets, you couldn't join thin pieces of metal together, because a nail needs length to create friction. So the rivet was required in order to hold metal together. And I've also talked about the nuts and the bolts. So I'm thinking about this huge skyscraper, which I was involved in building for 6, 7 years. And it's huge, it's the scale. We always talk about the height. It's the biggest building in Europe and the UK, blah, blah, blah. But what actually holds it together? It's the nut and the bolt. Without the nut and the bolt, these kind of structures cannot exist. And a nut and a bolt is a technology that can fit in the palm of my hand, and whose ancestor is the nail. But yet the nail persists. And I think that's what I love about the nail, that 6,000 years later, the fundamental shape of the nail has not changed. It still has a sharp point, it still has its body and a head, and that technology still persists, which I think is really amazing. Okay, so we're going to move on to the wheel. Have you heard the expression, don't reinvent the wheel? Yeah? Have you ever used that expression? Anybody that's used it, please leave now. I'm not your friend. So there's an expression, if you haven't heard it, don't reinvent the wheel. Because we invented the wheel and it was perfect, and we shouldn't reinvent it. So say you're trying to create a spreadsheet, and then somebody will say, no, don't reinvent the wheel, because we already have a different spreadsheet that does a very similar thing. So don't bother, don't reinvent the wheel. And my argument is we should reinvent the wheel, and we have been reinventing the wheel since the time the wheel first existed. So I think out of all the 7 objects that I selected, this is probably the most obvious one, but I still feel like there's a lot of surprises and interesting stories that I can tell you. I did this morning, I'm going to go back. Hopefully nobody read my slide too carefully. What do you think the wheel was first invented for? We think about the wheel for transport, right? Wheels, cars, planes, bicycles. What was it invented for? What was the purpose? Anybody brave enough to have a guess? Pumping? Yeah, pumping is a good answer, but that was still afterwards. Very good guess. It was for pottery. Okay, so 6,000 years ago, the ancient Mesopotamian civilization was growing. They have more people. They're starting agriculture. Where are they going to store all these grains? To make these big vessels and pots by hand used to take a really long time. And the walls of the pots might not be very consistent. They didn't last very long. And so they invented the potter's wheel to create big pots quickly, mass production, put all their grains in it. But the good thing about the potter's wheel is that gravity helps you, right? So you've got your stand, you have some kind of dip in that, and the potter's wheel fits in that, and you spin it, and gravity's keeping that in place. You turn it around by 90 degrees, and the thing just falls apart. So you need an axle, you need some kind of a connection. So to create that connection took another 2,000 years, right, which is a long time. But it's quite a complicated piece of engineering to create an axle of the right size. You need to have the right tools to be able to chisel out the perfect circles. You don't want too much friction, otherwise the material wears out and the vehicle can't move very well. So it was actually quite a difficult thing to create the wheel and the axle. And the first wheels that we had were solid wheels, so you had 3 planks of wood that were nailed together. You see, no wheels without the nail. The reason they used 3 planks is because if you just cut a tree trunk and just used a circle, the grains of the wood would be strong in one direction and weak in the other direction. So the way of reinforcing it was to have 3 planks put together. Then about 1,000 or 2,000 years later, we reinvented that to the spoked wheel, which of course we know is on our flag, and it's used in chariots, it's used in spinning cloth, lots of different uses. And this is a much lighter version of the solid wheel. And then it took about 3,000 years for the next reinvention to happen, which is when we created the wired wheel, which we see on bicycles. And again, this is one of those stories, like, it was not invented for bicycles. They used to use the wooden spoked wheels on bicycles first, so quite a kind of heavy, clunky thing to ride. The wire wheel was actually invented for flying machines, because these inventors want to go up into the sky, and they're saying we have these huge, clunky wheels, which are only any use to us when the aircraft is on the ground, but once you take off, it's dead weight. And so the wire wheel was invented in the 1700s for aircraft, and then it became the staple of bicycles. Then if you take away the edges, just like chip away the edges of the wheel, you get the gear. And I can't think of really any machines, or very few machines, that would not have gears in it. Gears are such an important part of all of our technology and engines and stuff. And then I think the most modern reinvention is the gyroscope. Are you familiar with gyroscopes? Yeah? Cool. So gyroscopes, if you haven't heard of it, is a spinning wheel on an axle, and the frame is made such you can move the frame, but the wheel, because of its momentum, stays in the same place. Or if you try to shift the axis of the wheel, then you feel a pushback, there's a reaction. And that's the technology used to orientate the International Space Station. Okay, so the International Space Station has got these big solar panels. They will open, they close, they change, which changes the momentum of the International Space Station. If you think about it, it's in space, so there's no pushback to correct that. So there are 4 giant wheels that are used. They're spinning very fast. They're about 1 meter in diameter. So every time there's a change in momentum of the International Space Station, they tweak the orientation of these wheels, and those wheels push back that reaction, and then the ISS corrects itself. Okay? So from the Potter's wheel to the International Space Station. And I just wanted to show you this image quickly, which is the patent. It's an American patent from 1886 by J.G. Cochrane, Josephine Cochrane. This is one of those rare instances. In the 1800s, women were not allowed to study engineering, not allowed to get a degree in engineering, but she got a patent for the first automatic dishwasher. So I've written her story in my book as well. And I found it so fascinating to go and look at her original work and her original filings, which are available online. So anyone can access that stuff. Okay, so the last story is about the magnet, and I'm waiting for your questions soon, okay? And I find magnets magical. You know, so we know about gravity. Gravity pulls us down. It's a force. It acts over long distances, but it's very weak. Magnets, you can feel that force. You play around with magnets, you can feel it. And this long-distance force allows us to communicate. It's the basis of all of our communication systems. So whether it's permanent magnets or whether it's electromagnets. So this speaker, this mic, is based on electromagnetism. It's based on converting my voice vibrations into a vibration of a magnet, which then changes the current in a coil. So that current, which is varying, goes into the speaker. That varying current does the opposite now. It sets off a magnet movement, which creates vibrations, which amplifies my voice. Right? So you wouldn't be able to hear me, probably, without the help of a magnet. So my story of the magnet is the story of 3 generations of my family. Okay, now I just came from the Kolkata Book Fair, and they loved this, because a lot of my story originates in Kolkata. The first telegraph system was built by the the British colonists in India, in Kolkata, and they were trying to figure out a way to communicate quickly with each other around the country. It's such a big country, they're trying to rule it, and they can't get messages quickly to each other, so they're trying to experiment with the telegraph system. So a doctor called William O'Shaughnessy came to India, and he started experimenting with electrical wires. And he said that if I use some kind of pulses or something in an electrical wire, maybe I can turn that into a language. And so his original design required somebody to hold these electrical wires and sit there, and then when the currents would come through and they were like jumping from the pain, they would write down how many pulses were coming through and try and create a language out of this. But luckily, a different physicist figured out that if you put a magnet near a varying current, then the magnet starts moving. That's the effect of electromagnetism. So eventually what he did was to create a language by putting a magnet on an axle, which would move when these electrical signals were coming. For example, if the magnet flicked to the left once, that was an A. If it flicked twice, it was a B. And so he basically created an entire language. Like Morse code is the American version of that. And in India, they were using a different version. And so I tell the story of the telegram, which couldn't have existed without magnetism. And my babuji, my grandfather, I think my uncle had gone off to Italy to study, and he hated it. So he used to send telegrams to my grandfather saying, please buy me a flight home. And my granddad used to ignore him, which is quite harsh. But eventually, he did pay for his flight to come back. So I know that my grandfather, for sure, used the telegraph system. The second one, and I'm going to kind of run through these a little bit more quickly, I think. The next one is the telephone. So with the telegram, we're using electromagnetism to send alphabets, basically, right? To send language. So that's almost the most basic form of using that technology. Then somebody said, well, what if I can vary the electrical current so fast that I can basically create a magnetic material? So say I have a disk made out of iron. I'm varying the current really, really quickly, and that disk is vibrating very, very quickly. So it creates vibrations, and basically sound is vibrations. So that's the next step up in the technology for communication, varying the current so fast that you're creating vibration. And that's how the first telephones were invented. Now, it's interesting because we have heard of Alexander Graham Bell as the inventor of the telephone, but I was digging a bit deeper into his story, and there's been a book written now, a biography of his life, and he filed his paperwork like 2 hours before somebody else did. And he apparently had a lot of money and lawyers at his disposal to basically have that influence to get the paperwork in. And so it just made me think about how his power and his privilege in society meant that his name is the one that we know, right? It could have been somebody else. It could have been the guy that was 2 hours later, and then we would all know his name, but that's not the name that we know. So if we've got a telephone now, okay? So I want to call you, so we have a cable between us. I want to call my mom, we have another cable between us. If my mom wants to call you, then you have to have a third cable between. If you add a third, fourth person, fifth person, sixth person, you can imagine how many wires are going to be everywhere. Okay, so what can we do? So what if all of the wires for us go to a central location? So that's the exchange. And there's somebody there. So I call up the exchange and say, hi, I want to talk to my mom. And then she, because normally these operators were women, will join my cable to my mom's cable, manually, using like jacks, like our headphone jacks. And then I would talk to her, and then I would finish, and I would tell her I'm done. She would remove it. Okay, and then my mom can call whoever else. So this is how all the telephone lines would come to an exchange. Now in the US, there was a small town, and there was an undertaker. Okay, so you know the person who arranges funerals when somebody dies. And he was the only undertaker in his village. But then a new undertaker came in, and he's wondering suddenly, why have I lost all my business? It shouldn't be like such a drastic change. And then he found out that the wife of the new undertaker was sitting in the exchange. That was her job. So if anybody called up and said, I want to speak to the undertaker, and even if they meant the original guy, she used to be like, yeah, I'll connect you, and connect them to her husband. So her husband's business would flourish. So he got irritated by this and said that I need to invent a system that removes this corruption, from the middle, so that I can get my business back. So he started tinkering around with electromagnets again to create the automatic exchange, and that's his patent from 1891. So now instead what happens is, supposing I dial, it used to be 2 digits, right, because there were not that many phones at the time. Supposing I dial 38. And you remember those old telephones which had the springs, and you had to dial the number, and it'd go tick, 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 tick. So when I dialed the 3, it would send 3 electrical pulses to the exchange, and the exchange would receive these 3 pulses and push this central arm up to the 3rd level. okay? Then I dial an 8, and 8 pulses go here. And now on the third level, there were 10 contact points, so it would rotate to the 8th contact point. Okay, so this was the automatic exchange. So now you don't need somebody to sit there connecting stuff up. And I think if I just go back, that is a photograph of a model of one of the original, so this is in the Science Museum in London. But you can imagine that as populations increased and more telephones were used, even this became like really overwhelming, huge. You used to have huge rooms and rooms full of this stuff. Now, of course, it's all digital, right? So it's all coded by ones and zeros. Which phone are you calling? It's all digital, so it's much quicker as well. And then the last one is the television. So how many of you still have those televisions with the big backside, with cathode ray tubes? Yeah? At least, I mean, I'm old enough to have grown up with those. And what I learned about that is it works because you're shooting an electron beam. Okay, so a beam of electrons goes to the screen, which has a chemical coating on it, and it lights up. So that point on that screen will light up when the electron beam is aimed at it. Okay, so if the electron beam is just going straight, you'll get one dot in the middle of your screen. So then the question is, how can you manipulate that beam to cover the whole screen? And the answer is magnets. Okay, so you change the electromagnetic field around this beam, and the way they programmed it is it would start at one top corner, go across, then it would jump down 2 lines and go across, jump down 2 lines, go across, it reaches the bottom, then it jumps back, and it goes to line number 2 and across, and then 4 and across, and 6 and across. But this process happened so fast that our eyes would see this as a moving picture. Okay? So the first time this technology was created as an electrical television was in Japan in the 1940s, 1930s, by an engineer called Kenjiro Takanayagi. And he was the father of the television in Japan. And again, an interesting one. So I've studied and lived in the UK for 25 years now. We are told that John Logie Baird invented the television. Or if you're American, Philo Farnworth invented the television. But the truth is that Takayanagi had invented it before them, but hadn't filed a patent, because that probably wasn't part of their culture and their scientific system. And then after Japan got bombed in the Second World War, his records were destroyed, and basically his work again has been lost. So it's really important to me to tell the stories of these figures from other parts of the world, that just because we didn't have the patent system doesn't mean that their work wasn't valid or valuable. And again, having just come from Kolkata, I've also written in my book about Jagdish Chandra Bose, who invented the coherer, which was the device that can receive the electromagnetic signal. So we knew how to receive an electromagnetic signal, but how do you interpret it? What do you do with that signal? And he created the device for that. So the radio wouldn't have existed without him. Again, he didn't file for a patent. He was working in colonial India in the 1800s in Calcutta. So again, his work has, we know about him here, but it's a name that's not very familiar in the West. So this is the point at which I ask any teachers in the audience to please leave the room, because I'm about to give you all the advice to break stuff. And I don't want your teachers to know where you got that information from, okay? So if any teachers here, just close your ears, please. Why am I saying you should break stuff? I think today our technology has become so complex, so it's like a black box. We have our mobile phones, we have like the speaker, my laptop, whatever. We don't really know what's going on inside of it. And very few of us are brave enough to actually get a screwdriver and open stuff up and look at it. And if something breaks, we have much more of a culture of fixing stuff in India, but in the West, it's actually cheaper just to get rid of your old toaster and buy a new one, because it costs not much money. And so the UK is the second biggest producer of electronic waste per person in the world, and we're throwing away 24 kilograms of electrical waste per person per year. That's a huge amount of waste. Okay, and I think we're second to Norway, and America comes third. And so my message to everybody is to be more curious about all the stuff that we have. You know, so that might seem really intimidating, a bit scary, a bit overwhelming, that, my God, how am I going to fix my laptop if it breaks, or if my speaker or my blender or whatever other devices I might have? So fine, let's start small. Let's start with these elements that I have talked to you about today. I've talked to you about 3, there's 4 more in my book. Let's appreciate those things. Like, hopefully all of you will appreciate nails a little bit more after today's talk. I certainly appreciate nails a little bit more since I did all my research. And I've also started, you know, I have a chapter on string. I've started sewing my own clothes about 3 weeks ago. And I'm never getting rid of those clothes. And there's so much of a culture of fast fashion nowadays, for example. So your relationship with your possessions changes if you understand them better, I think. Okay, so what I'm trying to encourage all of you to do is to be curious about the stuff that you have and find out about the stories, enjoy them. Okay, so thank you so much. So I'm just going to show you quickly my books. So my first book is called Built. This came out in 2018. And this is the stories of how we built our world. So some of the stuff about, you know, the ancient Romans, ancient Egyptians, how they built things, all the different stuff. So you can get this. I think they're just about available on Amazon or hopefully some other websites as well. This is the kids' version of the book, which an amazing artist illustrated for me. And she's just created these beautiful watercolor sketches. So if there's any young people in your life, there's a bit about Burj Khalifa, then please, this is hopefully quite a nice book for younger people. And Nuts and Bolts is my latest book. This is an old cover, but this is my latest book, which I've been talking to you about today. So the paperback of this comes out in the next week or 2, and those will be available also in India very soon. And hopefully you would have realized that my books, yes, they're about engineering, but they're actually the stories of engineering. They're the history, a bit of the ethics, the social impact. I've even written a thing about how the bicycle helped to liberate women, you know, once women were allowed to kind of have their own mode of transport, for example. And also the stories of these incredible inventors from all over the world. Finally, if you want to look up my work, my website is romatheengineer.com. I'm also on Instagram. I have a Twitter account, but I very rarely use it. That's Roma the Engineer as well. And on my website, if anyone's interested, I have a resources page, okay, where there are lots of different websites that will show you about different types of engineering, different projects around the world, some YouTube channels, some other stuff that might be interesting. And I also have, if you go into the book section of my website, there's a link to a virtual bookshop where I have a list of amazing science and engineering books, similar to mine, that like delve into like the bigger societal impacts and stuff of different scientific topics. So if you enjoy reading, then please go and have a look at that. So thank you so much for your very, very kind attention. I'm ready for questions now.
If you have any question. Please feel free to raise your hands if you have any questions.
Somebody needs to be brave and ask the first question. Otherwise, I will start telling you some jokes about engineering, which are really, really bad, and then you'll regret it. You want to hear the jokes? No. Okay, have you heard this one? Are you guys into relativity? A bar walks into a man. Oops, wrong frame of reference. Too niche. See, I'm telling you, these are bad jokes. So please ask me a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Roma, for the wonderful lecture. I just wrote you just selected the first breakthrough invention as a nail. So even before nails, I think wooden pieces, wedges, all those were in use. I think in what I see in Kerala, still our carpenters make their furniture without metallic nails. And I think even I'm heard of the wooden ships that made in Baipur in Calicut.
Okay.
That even BC era there were ships built from. Still they are making. They are also not using nails. I heard. So so I think you should add that before the nails.
Yeah.
You, please give an opinion about that.
Yeah, sure. This is a very good point, that there were technologies and certain pockets in the world where you could do this. So you've mentioned some examples now around this local area. And in Japan, a lot of the wooden houses there are built without nails as well. So they have a lot of very intricate connections that have to be very carefully carpentered to fit together. And in fact, one of the advantages of this kind of connections without nails, particularly in Japan, is when an earthquake hits, these connections have enough of flexibility in them to absorb some of that, and that's why the rate of collapses can be less. So now the nuance, which I didn't go into, is that you need a lot of skill in order to create these type of connections. And so there's not, it's not democratized, means not everybody can create those connections. So in these particular cases, what the nail did was to allow anybody to put stuff together and create that robustness. But you're 100% right that that's an incredible skill, which there are examples around the world where they were doing that. So thank you so much for mentioning that. Appreciate it. Who's going to be the second brave person? Why we should reinvent the wheel? Okay, so we should reinvent the wheel because if we didn't, then we would just have